The dust kicked up around Grace Keller's boots as she strode down the main street of Santa Rosa, New Mexico territory. But what caught her attention that sweltering afternoon in July of 1883 wasn't the heat or the grit in her teeth. It was the sound of a child crying out in pain, followed by cruel laughter that made her blood run cold. Grace had just finished purchasing supplies at the general store, her arms full of brown paper packages, when she heard the commotion coming from the alley between the bank and the smithy. Without thinking twice, she dropped her parcels right there in the street and hurried toward the sounds. What she found made her hands ball into fists at her sides. 3 boys, probably around 14 or 15 years old, had cornered a small Mexican boy who couldn't have been more than 7. The child's lip was already bleeding, and tears streaked down his dusty cheeks as the older boys taunted him, calling him names that Grace wouldn't repeat even in her own mind. One of them had just shoved the little one against the wooden wall of the smithy, and another was drawing back his fist for what would surely be a painful blow. "That's enough," Grace said, her voice cutting through the air like a whip crack. The 3 bullies turned to look at her, and the biggest one, a red-headed boy with a crooked nose, let out a laugh. "This ain't your concern, lady. Go back to your sewing or whatever it is you were doing." Grace stepped forward into the alley, positioning herself between the crying child and his tormentors. "I'm making it my concern. This boy hasn't done anything to deserve this treatment, and you 3 should be ashamed of yourselves." "He's just a dirty little Mexican," another boy said, spitting on the ground. "My pa says they're all thieves and liars." "Your pa is wrong," Grace said firmly. "Now apologize to this child and go home before I find your parents myself and tell them what kind of sons they're raising." The red-headed boy took a threatening step toward Grace, his face twisted with anger. "You got no right talking to us like that. You're just some nobody woman." Grace stood her ground, raising her chin defiantly. "I'm somebody who isn't going to stand by while 3 cowards pick on a child half their size. That makes me better than all 3 of you put together." The boy's hand shot out, grabbing for Grace's arm, but she was faster. She'd grown up with 4 older brothers on a ranch outside of town, and they'd taught her how to handle herself. Grace twisted away from his grip and brought her knee up sharply, catching him in the stomach hard enough to make him double over with a grunt. "You want to try that again?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. It was at that precise moment that Garrett Kane rounded the corner into the alley, drawn by the sounds of the altercation. He'd been in Santa Rosa for 3 days, having driven a herd of cattle up from Texas to sell at the railhead, and was planning to head back south by week's end. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. A woman with auburn hair pinned up beneath a simple bonnet stood facing down 3 boys who clearly had violence on their minds, and behind her cowered a small child whose frightened face was smeared with blood and tears. The woman's dress was modest calico, faded from many washings but clean and well-mended, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that spoke of determination that wouldn't bend. Garrett was a tall man, standing well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and hands calloused from years of ranch work. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing sun-bleached brown hair and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. At 26, he'd seen his share of trouble and wasn't looking for more, but something about the scene before him made it impossible to walk away. "Gentlemen," he said, his deep voice carrying easily in the confined space of the alley, "I think the lady asked you to leave." The 3 boys whirled around, and their bravado faltered when they saw the size of the cowboy blocking their exit. The red-headed one was still clutching his stomach, but he managed to straighten up enough to glare at Garrett. "This is a private matter," the boy said, though his voice lacked conviction now. "Doesn't look private to me," Garrett replied, moving further into the alley with slow, deliberate steps. "Looks like 3 big boys were picking on someone smaller than them, and a brave woman had to step in to stop it. That about sum it up." Grace turned to look at the newcomer properly for the first time, and something in her chest tightened unexpectedly. He had the weathered look of a man who spent his life outdoors, with lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun, and a scar along his jawline that spoke of past dangers. But his eyes were kind, she noticed, and there was no mockery in his expression as he looked at her, only respect. "These boys were attacking this child," Grace said, gesturing to the little one behind her who had pressed himself against the wall, trying to become invisible. "I was just explaining to them why that was unacceptable behavior." "Seems pretty clear to me too," Garrett agreed. "Boys, I suggest you head on home now. And if I hear about you bothering this little fellow or anyone else who can't defend themselves, I'll have a word with Sheriff Thompson. I'm sure he'd be real interested to know what you've been up to." The mention of the sheriff did what Grace's words and Garrett's presence had started. The 3 boys exchanged glances, then shuffled past Garrett toward the street, muttering under their breath, but no longer willing to continue their harassment. The red-headed one shot Grace a venomous look as he passed, but Garrett stepped between them, blocking the boys' view of her until all 3 had disappeared around the corner. Once they were gone, Grace immediately turned to the small boy, kneeling down so she was at his eye level. "Are you all right, sweetheart? Let me see your lip." The child was trembling, but he allowed Grace to examine his face gently. The cut on his lip wasn't deep, just bleeding freely the way mouth wounds tended to do. She pulled a clean handkerchief from her pocket and dabbed at it carefully. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Miguel," the boy whispered. "Miguel Hernandez." "Well, Miguel, you were very brave. Those boys were much bigger than you, but you didn't give up, did you?" Miguel shook his head, and a small, tremulous smile touched his lips despite the pain. "My mama says Hernandez men don't cry." "Your mama sounds like a wise woman," Grace said, though privately she thought that crying when you were hurt and scared was perfectly reasonable for anyone, let alone a 7-year-old child. "Where does your mama work?" "Let's get you back to her so she can make sure you're all right." "She cleans rooms at the hotel," Miguel said, his voice still small but steadier now. "The Santa Rosa Inn." Garrett, who had been standing quietly by, observing the woman's gentle interaction with the child, stepped forward. "I know where that is. I'm staying there myself. I'd be happy to walk you both over if that's agreeable to you, miss." Grace looked up at him from her kneeling position, studying his face for a long moment. She'd learned to be wary of strangers, particularly men she didn't know, but there was something honest in this cowboy's expression that put her at ease. Besides, he'd helped her when he could have just walked on by, and that spoke well of his character. "That's kind of you, mister," she began, trailing off in question. "Kane," he supplied, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Garrett Kane from down near El Paso way." "Grace Zimmerman," she replied, rising to her feet and taking Miguel's small hand in hers. "Though I go by my maiden name now, Keller. And yes, we'd appreciate your escort to the hotel." Garrett noticed the way she'd corrected herself, the mention of a maiden name that suggested a marriage that had ended somehow, but he was too polite to pry. Instead, he simply nodded and gestured for them to precede him out of the alley. "After you, Miss Keller." They emerged onto the main street, and Grace remembered her abandoned packages with a small gasp. "My supplies," she said, looking around in dismay. But her parcels were right where she'd left them, and to her surprise, an older woman Grace recognized as Mrs. Patterson, who owned the boarding house, was standing guard over them. Saw you drop these and run to help that child, Mrs. Patterson said, her wrinkled face breaking into an approving smile. Figured I'd make sure nobody walked off with them. You did a good thing today, Grace Keller. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson, Grace said gratefully, bending to gather her packages. Garrett beat her to it, scooping up all the parcels with ease. I've got these. You just worry about getting young Miguel here to his mother. The walk to the Santa Rosa Inn took only a few minutes, but it felt longer to Grace, who was acutely aware of the tall cowboy walking beside her, his arms full of her supplies. She kept stealing glances at him from the corner of her eye, noticing details she'd missed in the heat of the confrontation. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, and there was a gentleness in the way he'd spoken to Miguel that suggested he had experience with children. The Santa Rosa Inn was a two-story building on the corner of Main Street and Socorro Avenue, painted white with green shutters and a wide front porch where guests could sit in the evening and watch the town go by. As they climbed the front steps, Miguel suddenly pulled free from Grace's hand and darted inside, calling out for his mother in rapid Spanish. A moment later, a woman emerged from one of the ground-floor rooms, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and work-worn hands that spoke of years of hard labor. When she saw Miguel's bloody lip, her face went pale and she dropped to her knees, pulling him into her arms and speaking to him urgently in Spanish, checking him over for other injuries. Grace and Garrett waited respectfully while Miguel explained what had happened, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to tell the story. His mother's expression shifted from fear to anger to gratitude as she listened, and when Miguel finished, she rose to her feet and approached Grace with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her English heavily accented but clear. "Thank you for protecting my son. Those boys, they have bothered him before, but never this bad. I have been worried, but I cannot always be watching him. I'm just glad I was there," Grace said honestly. "Miguel is a brave boy, he did well. And this man?" Miguel's mother asked, looking at Garrett with curiosity and a hint of wariness. "He helped as well," Grace explained. "Mr. Kane here made sure those boys won't bother Miguel again." The woman's expression softened, and she inclined her head respectfully to Garrett. "You are a guest here, yes?" "I am Rosa Hernandez. If there is anything you need during your stay, anything at all, you have only to ask." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Hernandez," Garrett said, "but I was just doing what any decent person would do. You have a fine son there, you should be proud of him." Rosa Hernandez smiled, placing a protective hand on Miguel's shoulder. "I am. Every day I am. Now, Mijo, let us get you cleaned up and put some salve on that lip. Say thank you to the nice lady and the kind cowboy." Miguel, showing the resilience of childhood, managed a gap-toothed grin despite his swollen lip. "Thank you, miss. Thank you, Mr. Kane." After Miguel and his mother disappeared back into the hotel, Grace and Garrett stood on the porch for a moment in awkward silence. Grace realized she should probably take her parcels and go home, but she found herself reluctant to part ways with this stranger who had appeared just when she needed help. "I should get these things home," she finally said, reaching for her packages. "Thank you for your assistance back there, Mr. Kane. It was fortunate you came along when you did." "Looked to me like you had things well in hand," Garrett replied, but he didn't immediately release the parcels. "If you don't mind my saying so, that was a brave thing you did." Not many people would have stepped in like that. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks at the compliment. "I couldn't just walk by and do nothing. That boy was being hurt." "No, you couldn't," Garrett agreed, and there was something in the way he said it that made Grace think he understood exactly what she meant. But brave and kind are rarer qualities than they should be. Your husband is a lucky man to have such a wife. I'm not married, Grace said, then immediately wished she hadn't been quite so quick to correct him. I was briefly, but my husband passed away 2 years ago. Fever took him. Garrett's expression sobered. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Keller. It's all right, Grace said, and realized she meant it. The raw grief that had consumed her for so long had finally faded to a dull ache she'd learned to live with. We weren't married long, and if I'm being honest, it wasn't a happy match. My father arranged it, and I didn't know Benjamin well enough to refuse. But he's gone now, and I've made my peace with it. She wasn't sure why she was telling this stranger such personal details, but something about Garrett Kane invited confidence. He didn't pry or push, just listened with patient attention that made her feel heard. Where do you live? Garrett asked. I'd be happy to walk you home with these packages. It's the least I can do after you showed such courage back there. Grace hesitated, but only for a moment. I have a small house on the edge of town, past the church. It's not far, but I wouldn't say no to the help. Some of those packages are heavier than they look. They set off down the street together, and Grace found herself relaxing into the rhythm of walking beside this tall, quiet cowboy. He didn't fill the silence with meaningless chatter, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and genuine. How long have you lived in Santa Rosa? He asked as they passed the church, a modest adobe structure with a bell tower that dominated the north end of town. All my life, Grace replied. My father has a ranch about 5 miles outside of town, raises horses mostly. I grew up there with my 4 brothers, and I suppose I never saw much reason to leave. Even after Benjamin died and I could have gone anywhere, this place is home. 4 brothers, Garrett said with a slight smile. That explains why you knew how to handle yourself back there. I've got 2 sisters myself, and they're tougher than most men I know. Are they still in Texas? Grace asked, genuinely curious. My older sister married a rancher near San Antonio. My younger one is teaching school in Austin. And my parents are still running the family ranch where I grew up, though my father's not as spry as he used to be. I try to visit when I can, but work keeps me on the road more often than not. What kind of work brings you to Santa Rosa? Grace asked as they turned onto the quiet street where her small house stood. Cattle drive, Garrett explained. We brought a herd up from Texas to sell at the railhead here. Good prices right now, and my boss wanted to take advantage of the market. We'll be heading back south in a few days, once we've rested the horses and restocked our supplies. Grace felt an unexpected pang of disappointment at the thought of him leaving so soon, which was ridiculous considering she'd only just met the man. But there was something about Garrett Kane that made her want to know him better, to learn his stories and share her own. Her house came into view, a small wooden structure painted yellow with white trim, and a neat garden out front where she grew vegetables and flowers. It wasn't much, but it was hers, bought with the small inheritance Benjamin had left and the money she made taking and sewing and mending for the townspeople. This is me, Grace said, stopping at the front gate. If you'll just set those packages on the porch, I can manage from there. Garrett did as she asked, carefully placing each parcel on the wooden porch where they'd be out of the sun. When he straightened up, he met Grace's eyes, and she felt that strange tightening in her chest again, as if something significant was happening that she didn't quite understand yet. Thank you again for your help today, Grace said softly. It was kind of you. It was my pleasure, Miss Keller, Garrett replied, settling his hat back on his head. I hope the rest of your day is less eventful. He turned to go, but Grace found herself speaking before she could think better of it. Mr. Kane, would you like to stay for supper? It's the least I can do to thank you properly, and I was planning to make more than I can eat anyway." Garrett paused, turning back to look at her with surprise that quickly shifted to pleasure. "I wouldn't want to impose." "You wouldn't be," Grace assured him, her heart beating faster than it should. "I'd enjoy the company, and I make a decent chicken stew if I do say so myself." "In that case, Miss Keller, I'd be honored to accept your invitation." Grace smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the July heat. "Come back around 6 o'clock then. That should give me time to get everything ready." After Garrett left, Grace stood on her porch for a long moment, watching him walk back toward town with that easy, confident stride. What had she just done? She'd invited a man she'd only just met to dinner in her home, something she'd never done before in her life. But somehow it felt right, as if fate or providence or whatever force governed the universe had brought Garrett Kane into her path for a reason. Shaking her head at her own fanciful thoughts, Grace gathered up her packages and went inside to prepare for her unexpected guest. She had a chicken in the cold cellar that would do nicely for stew, and fresh vegetables from her garden. As she worked, chopping onions and carrots and setting the chicken to simmer in her large pot, she found herself humming an old song her mother used to sing, a sound that had been absent from this house for far too long. True to his word, Garrett appeared at her front gate just as the church bells chimed 6 o'clock. He'd clearly taken time to wash up and change his shirt, trading the dusty work clothes for a clean white shirt and vest that made him look almost respectable, though his worn boots and sun-darkened skin still marked him as a working cowboy rather than a town gentleman. Grace had also taken extra care with her appearance, changing into her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out the green in her hazel eyes, and letting her auburn hair down from its usual severe bun to hang in a softer style around her shoulders. When she opened the door to Garrett's knock, she saw appreciation flash across his face before he schooled his expression back to polite neutrality. "Come in," Grace said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I hope you like chicken stew." "One of my favorite meals," Garrett assured her, removing his hat and holding it awkwardly in his hands as he looked around her small front room. The house might have been modest in size, but Grace had made it warm and welcoming. Colorful quilts draped over the furniture, curtains she'd sewn herself hung at the windows, and books lined a small shelf in the corner. A pot of wildflowers sat on the table, and the smell of baking bread mingled with the savory aroma of the stew. "You have a nice home," Garrett said sincerely. "Feels peaceful." "Thank you," Grace replied, pleased by his observation. "It's small, but it suits me. Please have a seat at the table. Everything's ready." The meal was simple but good, and Grace found herself enjoying Garrett's company more than she'd anticipated. He had a quiet sense of humor that surprised her into laughter more than once, and he asked thoughtful questions about her life in Santa Rosa, seeming genuinely interested in her answers. In turn, Grace learned more about Garrett. He'd been working cattle since he was 15, learning the trade from his father and older hands on the family ranch. He'd seen most of Texas and New Mexico territory in his travels, and he spoke fondly of the open range, the challenge of the work, and the satisfaction of bringing a herd safely to market. "Don't you ever want to settle down?" Grace asked as she served him a second helping of stew. "All that traveling must get lonely." Garrett was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I suppose I always figured I would eventually. Find a good woman, build a house, maybe start a ranch of my own. But the right opportunity never seemed to come along, and I guess I got comfortable with the life I was leading. It's not a bad life, moving with the seasons, seeing new places." "But," Grace prompted, sensing there was more he wasn't saying, "but it's not a life for an old man," Garrett admitted. And I'm not getting any younger. Sometimes I think about my father, how proud he is of the ranch he built, the legacy he's leaving for his children and grandchildren. And I wonder what I'll have to show for my years when I'm his age. You have time to build that legacy, Grace said gently. You're what, 25, 26? 26, Garrett confirmed. And you? 23, Grace replied. Old enough to know what I want, but young enough to still hope I might get it. And what is it you want, Miss Keller? Garrett asked, his gray-green eyes intent on her face. Grace hadn't expected the question, and she found herself answering with more honesty than she might have otherwise. I want what most women want, I suppose. A family, children, someone to share my life with who actually wants to be with me. My marriage to Benjamin, it wasn't, he didn't. She paused, struggling to find the right words. He married me because my father offered him land as a dowry, and I married him because I thought it was my duty. But there was no love in it, no real partnership. I want more than that. I want what my parents had before my mother died, that sense of being a team facing life together. That's not too much to ask, Garrett said softly. Any man would be lucky to have a woman like you by his side. The intensity in his voice made Grace's breath catch, and suddenly the small kitchen felt even smaller, the space between them charged with something she didn't quite dare name. She looked down at her plate, breaking the moment, and reached for the pitcher of water. Would you like some pie? She asked, her voice not quite steady. I made apple yesterday, and it should still be good. I'd love some, Garrett replied, and if he noticed her sudden nervousness, he was gentleman enough not to mention it. They talked late into the evening, long after the pie had been eaten, and the dishes washed and put away. Grace found herself telling Garrett things she'd never told anyone, about how isolated she'd felt after her mother's death when she was 12, how her brothers had tried their best, but couldn't quite fill that void, how her father had retreated into his work and left her to raise herself. She told him about Benjamin's death, the relief she'd felt mixed with guilt over that relief, and the slow process of building a life for herself on her own terms. In return, Garrett shared his own stories. He told her about a cattle stampede that had nearly killed him 3 years ago, leaving him with the scar on his jaw and a healthy respect for the power of frightened animals. He talked about his sisters, the way his older sister had basically raised him after their mother took sick one winter and was never quite the same, and how his younger sister had defied their father's wishes to pursue teaching instead of marrying the rancher's son their father had picked out for her. She sounds brave, Grace said, standing up to your father like that. She is, Garrett agreed. Reminds me of someone else I met today, actually. Someone who wasn't afraid to stand up to 3 bullies twice her size to protect a child she didn't even know. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest at the comparison. I just did what anyone would do. But they didn't, Garrett pointed out. I'm sure plenty of people saw what was happening to Miguel, but you were the only one who stepped in. That takes courage, Grace, and kindness. Those boys could have really hurt you. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice did strange things to her pulse. You used my name, she said, then felt foolish for pointing it out. I apologize if that was too familiar, Garrett said quickly. I should have asked permission first. No, I liked it, Grace admitted, and you should call me Grace. Miss Keller sounds too formal after everything we've talked about tonight. May I call you Garrett? I'd like that, he replied, and his smile transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made Grace's heart skip a beat when Garrett finally rose to leave. Well past 10 o'clock, Grace found herself reluctant to let him go. They stood at her front door, The summer night warm and full of cricket song around them, and Grace searched for words to extend the evening just a little longer. "When do you leave Santa Rosa?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "4 more days," Garrett said. "We're waiting for a few of the horses to rest up from the drive, and then we'll head back to Texas. Should take us about 3 weeks if the weather holds." 4 days. It wasn't enough time, Grace thought, though what it wasn't enough time for, she wasn't quite ready to admit to herself. She'd only just met this man, but already she felt a connection to him that defied logic or reason. "Will you come to dinner again tomorrow?" The words were out before Grace could stop them, and she held her breath waiting for his response. Garrett's expression softened, and he reached out to gently touch her hand where it rested on the doorframe. "I'd like that very much, but only if you'll let me bring something this time. It doesn't seem right, you doing all the cooking." "All right," Grace agreed. "Surprise me." After Garrett left, Grace sat by her window for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead and trying to understand what was happening to her. She'd thought, after Benjamin, that she was done with men, that whatever capacity she'd had for romantic feelings had been crushed by her loveless marriage. But Garrett Kane had awakened something in her she'd thought was dead, a longing for connection and partnership that scared her even as it filled her with hope. The next morning, Grace was up early, tending her garden and trying to keep herself busy so she wouldn't spend the entire day thinking about the evening ahead. But despite her best efforts, Garrett occupied her thoughts constantly. She found herself remembering little details from their conversation: the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the careful respect with which he'd spoken about his sisters, the gentleness he'd shown toward young Miguel. Around mid-morning, Grace was surprised by a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found Rosa Hernandez standing on her porch, Miguel at her side. The boy's lip was healing well, the swelling already down significantly, and he was smiling as he held out a small bunch of wildflowers. "For you," Miguel said in his careful English. "For helping me." Grace accepted the flowers with genuine pleasure, bending down to Miguel's level. "These are beautiful, Miguel. Thank you so much." "My mama wanted to come too," Miguel explained, "to say thank you properly." Rosa stepped forward, pressing a small package wrapped in cloth into Grace's hands. "Fresh tortillas," she said, "and some sweet bread I made this morning. It is not much, but I wanted you to know how grateful I am for what you did yesterday. Those boys, they have left Miguel alone today. I think perhaps they learned their lesson." "I'm so glad to hear that," Grace said warmly. "Please, won't you come in for some coffee?" Rosa hesitated, clearly aware that her social position as a hotel maid didn't usually warrant invitations into the homes of white women, even those of modest means like Grace. But Grace's smile was genuine and welcoming, and after a moment, Rosa accepted. Over coffee and some of Rosa's sweet bread, which was delicious, the two women talked. Grace learned that Rosa's husband had died in a mining accident 5 years earlier, leaving her alone with Miguel to support. She'd taken the job at the hotel, which didn't pay much but came with a small room where she and Miguel could live. She worked hard, dreaming of one day saving enough money to open a small restaurant of her own, serving the foods of her childhood. "That sounds wonderful," Grace said enthusiastically. "The food you make is delicious. I'm sure people would come from miles around to eat at your restaurant." "It is just a dream," Rosa said with a self-deprecating shrug. "But dreams are free, no?" "Dreams are where everything starts," Grace replied firmly. "My mother used to say that if you can dream it clearly enough, you can make it real, and I believe her." When Rosa and Miguel left an hour later, Grace felt lighter somehow, as if she'd made a genuine friend. Rosa had invited her to come by the hotel anytime for coffee, and they'd made tentative plans to attend church together the following Sunday. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to Grace, who'd felt isolated for so long after her mother's death and her brief, unhappy marriage. The day passed slowly despite Grace's attempts to keep busy. She cleaned her already clean house, mended clothing that didn't really need mending, and baked fresh bread for dinner. By the time 6 o'clock approached, she'd changed her dress 3 times and was seriously questioning her sanity for getting so worked up over a simple dinner. But when Garrett appeared at her gate, carrying a covered basket and wearing another clean shirt, Grace's nervousness transformed into excitement. Whatever was happening between them, whatever this connection was that had sparked into life over a shared moment of protecting a child, Grace decided to stop questioning it and simply enjoy it. "I hope you like fish," Garrett said as Grace let him in. "I bought some fresh trout from a man down by the river this afternoon, and I thought we could fry them up together." "I love fish," Grace said honestly. "And I have some potatoes we can roast and green beans from my garden." They cooked together in Grace's small kitchen, and there was an ease to their collaboration that surprised them both. Garrett proved surprisingly competent at the stove, explaining that he'd learned to cook out of necessity on the cattle drives, where every man had to take his turn preparing meals. Grace found herself laughing at his stories about cooking disasters on the trail, including one memorable incident involving a skunk, a poorly secured food supply, and 3 days of eating nothing but hardtack and beans. "I don't think I've laughed this much in years," Grace admitted as they sat down to eat. "You're good company, Garrett Kane." "So are you, Grace Keller," he replied, and the warmth in his voice made her feel like the most important person in the world. They talked late into the night again, and as Grace listened to Garrett describe his dreams of one day owning his own ranch, she found herself imagining what it would be like to be part of those dreams. She could picture a house somewhere on the open range, children running through the rooms, cattle lowing in the distance as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. And in all those images, Garrett was there beside her, solid and steady and true. It was a dangerous thing to imagine, Grace knew. Garrett would be leaving in 3 days, returning to Texas, and a life that didn't include her. But she couldn't seem to stop the feelings growing in her heart, couldn't prevent herself from falling for this kind, brave cowboy who'd appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. When Garrett finally left that night, he paused at the door, his hand resting lightly on Grace's arm. "Grace, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" she asked, her heart suddenly pounding. "I haven't felt this way about anyone in a long time," Garrett said carefully. "Maybe ever, if I'm being honest. I know we've only just met and I'm leaving soon, but I can't pretend I don't feel a connection to you. If that's too forward, if I'm overstepping, please tell me and I'll back off. But I needed you to know." Grace's breath caught in her throat, and she made a decision in that moment that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "You're not overstepping. I feel it too, this connection, and I don't want you to back off. I don't know what it means or where it can possibly go, but I want to find out." Garrett's hand moved from her arm to cup her cheek gently, his thumb brushing across her skin with a tenderness that made Grace's eyes well with unexpected tears. "Then let's find out together," he said softly. "I have 3 more days here. Let's make the most of them." The next day, Garrett appeared at Grace's house in the morning, leading 2 horses. "I thought maybe you'd like to get out of town for a bit," he said with a slightly nervous smile. "I borrowed these from the livery. The owner said there's a nice spot a few miles north where the river widens out into a swimming hole. Would you like to go?" Grace hadn't been riding in months, Not since she'd sold her own horse to help pay for some repairs on the house. But the idea of spending the day with Garrett away from the curious eyes of the town appealed to her immensely. "Give me 10 minutes to change and pack some food." The ride north was glorious, the summer day warm but not oppressive, with a breeze that kept the worst of the heat at bay. Grace had forgotten how much she loved riding, the feeling of freedom that came from moving across the land with nothing but sky overhead. Garrett was clearly an experienced horseman, sitting easy in his saddle and handling his mount with the casual competence of someone who'd spent his life on horseback. They talked as they rode, but there were also comfortable stretches of silence where they simply enjoyed the landscape around them and each other's company. When they reached the swimming hole, Grace had to admit it was a perfect spot. The river widened here into a deep pool, shaded by cottonwood trees and bordered by smooth rocks perfect for sitting on. The water was crystal clear, and Grace could see fish darting through the shallows. They spread a blanket under one of the trees and unpacked the lunch Grace had prepared. As they ate, Garrett told her more about his work, describing the satisfaction of successfully driving a herd across difficult terrain, the camaraderie of the men he worked with, and the quiet joy of sleeping under the stars night after night. "It sounds wonderful," Grace said wistfully. "I've lived in Santa Rosa my whole life. I've never been more than 50 miles from where I was born." "Would you want to travel?" Garrett asked. "If you had the chance." "I think so," Grace said thoughtfully. "Not forever, maybe, but I'd like to see more of the world. My mother used to tell me stories about where she grew up, back east in Virginia. She described mountains that reached the clouds and forests so thick you couldn't see the sky. I'd like to see places like that." "You should," Garrett said firmly. "Life's too short to spend it all in one place if you have dreams of seeing more." Grace laughed softly. "Dreams are easy. Actually doing something about them is harder, especially when you're a woman on your own." "You won't always be on your own," Garrett said, and something in his voice made Grace's heart race. "Won't I?" she asked quietly. Garrett set down his half-eaten sandwich and turned to face Grace fully. "I know this is fast. I know we've only known each other 3 days. But Grace, I can't ignore what I'm feeling. You're the most remarkable woman I've ever met. You're brave and kind and funny and beautiful, and when I think about leaving Santa Rosa without you, it feels like I'm leaving part of myself behind." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. "I feel the same way. But Garrett, what can we do? You have to go back to Texas and my life is here." "Come with me," Garrett said, taking her hands in his. "I know it's asking a lot, maybe too much. But I'm asking anyway. Come with me to Texas. Marry me, Grace. Help me build that ranch I've been dreaming about. We can make a life together, have the family you want, the partnership you've been missing. I know I don't have much to offer right now beyond a steady job and a lot of hard work ahead, but I promise you'll never doubt that you're loved and valued. I promise I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of your courage and kindness." Grace's mind was spinning. Marriage. To a man she'd known for 3 days. It was madness, completely irrational. But her heart knew the truth of what Garrett was offering. This wasn't like her marriage to Benjamin, a cold arrangement made for practical reasons. This was real feeling, genuine connection, the possibility of the kind of love she'd always dreamed of but never truly believed she'd find. "I need to think," Grace said, her voice trembling. It's so much, so fast." "I know," Garrett said, squeezing her hands gently. "And I don't want to pressure you. Take whatever time you need. But Grace, I need you to know that I'm serious about this. This isn't some flight of fancy or a cowboy's whim. I'm falling in love with you, and I think you might be falling in love with me too." "I am," Grace whispered, the admission feeling like leaping off a cliff into unknown waters. "I am falling in love with you and it terrifies me." "Why?" Garrett asked gently. "Because I was married before and it was awful," Grace said, the words spilling out of her now that she'd started. "Benjamin didn't love me. He barely tolerated me. He wanted a housekeeper and a cook, not a wife, and certainly not a partner. When he died, I was so relieved, and I felt terrible about feeling relieved. And I promised myself I'd never put myself in that position again, never give someone that much power over my happiness. But here you are, and I want to believe it could be different, but what if it's not? What if I follow you to Texas and discover you're not who I think you are?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment, and Grace could see him carefully considering his words. "I can't promise I'm perfect because I'm not. I have flaws and failings like everyone else, but I can promise you honesty, Grace. I can promise that I'll never lie to you or mislead you about who I am or what I want. And what I want is a partner, not a servant. I want someone to build a life with, someone whose dreams matter as much as mine, someone I can respect and admire and love with my whole heart. I think you're that person, but if you need more time to be sure, I understand." "How much time do I have?" Grace asked practically. "You leave tomorrow." "Actually, I talked to my boss this morning," Garrett said. "Told him I needed a few more days in Santa Rosa to handle some personal business. He agreed to let me stay through the end of next week if I need to. So you have time, Grace. Don't make this decision in a rush. Think about it, pray about it if you're so inclined, and give me your answer when you're ready." Grace felt some of the pressure ease at knowing she had more than just a few hours to decide something so momentous. "Thank you for understanding." "Of course," Garrett said. "Now, how about we enjoy the rest of this beautiful day? No more heavy conversation. Just two people spending time together and getting to know each other better." They spent the afternoon by the river, talking and laughing and gradually relaxing back into the easy companionship they'd found over their dinners together. Garrett skipped stones across the water while Grace waded in the shallows, her skirts tied up to keep them dry. They saw a deer come down to drink on the far bank, and a family of ducks paddled by with their ducklings following in a neat line. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, they packed up their things and rode back to Santa Rosa. Grace found herself watching Garrett as they traveled, studying the line of his profile against the sunset, the easy way he moved with his horse, the strength evident in his hands and shoulders. He was a good man, she thought. An honest man. The kind of man she could build a life with if she was brave enough to take the chance. That night, Grace lay awake for hours, turning Garrett's proposal over in her mind from every angle. The practical part of her brain listed all the reasons it was a terrible idea. She'd known him less than a week. She'd be leaving everything familiar behind, moving to a place she'd never seen, among people she'd never met. What if his family didn't like her? What if she couldn't adjust to life in Texas? What if? But her heart kept whispering something different. It whispered that Garrett Kane was the kind of man women dreamed of finding. That the connection between them was rare and precious, something to be treasured rather than thrown away out of fear. That she'd been half alive since Benjamin's death, going through the motions of living without really experiencing any joy, and Garrett had awakened her back to full, vibrant life in just a few short days. By morning, Grace knew what her answer would be, but she wanted to be completely certain before she gave it. She spent the day visiting the people and places that had made up her life in Santa Rosa. She walked through the town square, greeting neighbors she'd known all her life. She visited the cemetery where her mother and Benjamin were buried, spending time at each grave and trying to imagine what they would tell her to do. Her mother, Grace thought, would have told her to follow her heart. Her mother had married Grace's father for love, defying her own family back east who'd wanted her to marry someone more socially prominent. She'd traveled west as a young bride, leaving behind everything she'd known, and she'd never regretted it despite the hardships of ranch life. Benjamin's grave was harder. Grace stood looking at the simple wooden cross bearing his name and felt sorrow for all they could have been to each other if circumstances had been different. "I'm sorry we couldn't make each other happy," she said softly. "But I think I've found someone who might be able to. I hope you'd be glad for me." Her final visit was to her father's ranch. She rode out in the afternoon, finding her father in the stable looking over a new foal. Samuel Keller was a hard man, weathered by years of working the land, but his face softened when he saw his daughter. "Grace," he said, embracing her briefly, "this is a surprise. I wasn't expecting you today." "I needed to talk to you, Papa," Grace said, "about something important." They sat in the stable office, and Grace told her father about Garrett, about his proposal, about the choice she was facing. Samuel listened without interrupting, his weathered face giving nothing away until Grace finished speaking. "You love him?" Samuel asked bluntly. "I think I do," Grace said honestly. "I know it's too soon to be certain, but what I feel for him is stronger than anything I've ever felt before. Certainly stronger than anything I felt for Benjamin." Samuel sighed heavily. "I made a mistake with Benjamin. I thought I was doing right by you, arranging a match that would keep you close and secure. But I saw how unhappy you were, and I've regretted it every day since. If this cowboy makes you happy, if you truly believe he's a good man who'll treat you right, then you have my blessing." "Really?" Grace felt tears spring to her eyes at her father's unexpected support. "Really," Samuel confirmed. "Life's too short to let chances for happiness slip by, Grace. Your mother taught me that. She took a huge risk coming west with me, and I spent every day of our marriage trying to be worthy of that faith she showed in me. If this Garrett Kane is worth even half of what your mother was, you'll have a good life with him." Grace hugged her father tightly, feeling his arms come around her in a rare display of affection. "Thank you, Papa. That means more than you know." "When will you leave?" Samuel asked as they pulled apart. "Soon, I think. Within the week if I give Garrett my answer tonight." "Then you'd better get back to town," Samuel said gruffly. "And Grace, write to me. Let me know you're safe and happy. And bring this cowboy by before you leave so I can take his measure properly." Grace rode back to Santa Rosa as the sun was setting, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She went straight to the hotel, asking the man at the front desk for Garrett's room number. When she knocked on his door, he answered quickly, surprise and hope warring on his face when he saw her. "Grace, is everything all right?" "Yes," Grace said, suddenly breathless with the enormity of what she was about to do. "Everything is perfect, and my answer is yes, Garrett. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll come to Texas with you. Yes to all of it." For a moment, Garrett just stared at her, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then joy broke across his face like sunrise, and he pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around in the hallway. "You mean it? You're sure?" "I'm sure," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I'm terrified and excited and completely sure." Garrett set her down gently, cupping her face in his hands. "I promise you won't regret this, Grace. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you don't regret this." And then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Grace felt like she was finally, truly coming home. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Garrett extended his stay in Santa Rosa by another week, giving them time to make arrangements and plans. They decided to get married before leaving for Texas, wanting to start their journey as husband and wife rather than courting couple. The town of Santa Rosa might have been small, but news traveled fast, and soon everyone knew that Grace Keller was marrying the cowboy who'd helped her defend young Miguel. The general consensus seemed to be approval, though there were a few who thought Grace was being hasty. Rosa Hernandez was thrilled when Grace told her the news, insisting on making the wedding cake as a gift. "You helped my son," Rosa said firmly. "This is the least I can do for you." Grace's brothers came into town for the wedding, along with their wives and children. They'd been protective of Grace after Benjamin's death, worried about their sister living alone, and they were cautiously pleased to see her so happy. Garrett won them over quickly, meeting their questions about his intentions and prospects with straightforward honesty that impressed even the most skeptical of them. Samuel Keller held a dinner at the ranch the night before the wedding, giving Grace's family a chance to celebrate with the couple. It was a lively evening full of food and laughter and stories, and watching Garrett interact easily with her brothers and their children, Grace felt her last doubts melt away. This was right. He was right. They were right together. The wedding itself took place in the small adobe church on a perfect morning in late July of 1883. Grace wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair. Garrett wore his best suit, looking almost uncomfortable in the formal clothing but handsome nonetheless. Father Martinez, the elderly priest who'd known Grace since childhood, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Grace's hands shook as she repeated her vows, but Garrett held them steady, his own voice firm and sure as he promised to love and cherish her for all their days. When Father Martinez pronounced them husband and wife, and Garrett kissed her in front of God and the assembled witnesses, Grace felt like her heart might burst from happiness. This was so different from her first wedding, that cold, formal affair where she and Benjamin had barely looked at each other. This was joy and hope, and the beginning of something beautiful. The whole town turned out for the celebration afterward in the town square. Someone had brought a fiddle, someone else a guitar, and soon there was music and dancing. Grace found herself passed from partner to partner, spinning and laughing until she was breathless. But her eyes kept finding Garrett across the crowd, and every time their gazes met, she felt that connection spark between them, stronger than ever now that they were bound together. As the sun began to set, Garrett finally claimed his bride, pulling her into his arms for a slow dance as the fiddle played a gentle waltz. "Happy," he murmured against her hair. "More than I ever thought possible," Grace replied honestly. "How did this happen? How did we find each other?" "I think we were meant to," Garrett said. "I think you were always supposed to step into that alley to help Miguel, and I was always supposed to come around that corner at just the right moment to see how brave and kind you are. Everything else just followed naturally." "I love you," Grace said, the words coming easily now that she'd given herself permission to feel them. "I know it's fast, but I do. I love you, Garrett Kane." "I love you too, Grace Kane," Garrett replied, and the way he said her new name made Grace's heart soar. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." They left Santa Rosa 3 days later, Grace's few possessions packed onto a wagon Garrett had bought for the journey. Saying goodbye to her father and brothers was harder than Grace had expected, but they promised to visit once Garrett had his ranch established, and Grace promised to write regularly. The journey to Texas took 3 weeks, just as Garrett had predicted. It was hard travel at times, camping under the stars each night, dealing with heat and dust, and the occasional rainstorm that turned the roads to mud. But Grace discovered that she loved it, loved the sense of adventure and freedom, loved waking each morning next to her husband, and knowing they were building their life together one day at a time. Garrett was patient and gentle with her, taking time to make sure she was comfortable with the physical aspects of their marriage. He'd clearly had some experience, though he was too much of a gentleman to discuss previous relationships. But he made sure Grace's first time with him was as pleasant as possible. And as the days passed and they grew more accustomed to each other, Grace found joy in the intimacy they shared, the way their bodies learned to move together just as their hearts had. They talked for hours as they traveled, sharing stories and dreams and plans. Garrett told Grace about the piece of land he had his eye on, near his family's ranch but far enough away to be truly their own. He described the house he wanted to build, with a wide porch and plenty of windows to let in the light. Grace told him about the garden she wanted to plant, the children she hoped they'd have, the life she wanted to create together. When they finally crossed into Texas and turned south toward El Paso, Grace felt anticipation building in her chest. Soon she would meet Garrett's family, see the land that would become their home, begin the next chapter of their life together. The Kane family ranch was everything Garrett had described and more. The house was a sprawling adobe structure with the wide porch he'd mentioned, and the land stretched away in every direction, rolling hills covered in grass where cattle grazed peacefully. Garrett's parents, Thomas and Margaret Kane, welcomed Grace with open arms. Margaret was a sturdy woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, and she embraced Grace like a long-lost daughter. Thomas was tall like his son, with the same gray-green eyes and quiet strength, and after sizing Grace up for a long moment, he nodded approvingly and shook her hand with genuine warmth. "So you're the woman who finally caught our boy's heart," Thomas said with a slight smile. "Garrett's been telling us about you in his letters. Welcome to the family, Grace." They stayed with Garrett's parents for a few weeks while Garrett finalized the purchase of their land and began making plans for their house. Grace helped Margaret with the cooking and cleaning, learning the rhythms of ranch life and growing to love her new mother-in-law's straightforward manner and kind heart. The land Garrett bought was beautiful, 100 acres of good grazing land with a creek running through it and views that took Grace's breath away. They broke ground on their house in late August, and with help from Garrett's father and brothers-in-law, the basic structure was up by September. It wasn't fancy, their house. Just 4 rooms to start with, though they planned to add on as their family grew. But it was solid and well built, and when Grace stepped across the threshold for the first time as Garrett carried her inside, she felt like she was finally, truly home. They spent the fall getting settled, buying cattle and horses, building fences and corrals. It was hard work, harder than Grace had ever done before, but she loved it. She loved working side by side with Garrett, loved the satisfaction of falling into bed each night exhausted but fulfilled, loved waking each morning to see the sun rise over land that belonged to them. In December, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but she waited to tell Garrett until she was certain, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. When she finally shared the news one evening after supper, Garrett's face lit up with joy so pure it brought tears to Grace's eyes. "A baby," he said wonderingly, dropping to his knees in front of where Grace sat and pressing his face against her still flat stomach. "Our baby, Grace, this is, I can't even find the words." "Happy?" Grace asked, running her fingers through his hair. "Beyond happy," Garrett confirmed. "Blessed. Grateful. Terrified that I'll mess it up somehow." "You won't," Grace assured him. "You're going to be a wonderful father. I see how you are with your nephews and nieces when we visit. You're patient and kind and fun. Our children are going to adore you." "Children," Garrett repeated, plural. "You want more than one. As many as God blesses us with," Grace said. "I always wanted a big family. Is that all right with you?" "More than all right," Garrett said, rising to pull Grace into his arms. "I want to fill this house with children. with laughter and love and all the noise that comes with a big family. And I want to grow old with you, Grace, watching our children grow and have children of their own, building a legacy together. Their son was born in July of 1884, exactly 1 year after Grace and Garrett had married. The labor was long and difficult, attended by Garrett Kane and the local midwife. But when Grace finally held her baby boy in her arms, she knew every moment of pain had been worth it. They named him Thomas Samuel, after both his grandfathers, though they called him Tom from the start. He had Garrett's gray-green eyes and Grace's auburn hair, and he was perfect in every way. Watching Garrett with his son, Grace fell in love with her husband all over again. He was so gentle with the baby, so patient and attentive, that Grace sometimes found herself in tears just watching them together. This was what she'd always wanted, she realized. This family, this life, this love that grew stronger every day. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose after her two grandmothers, arrived 18 months later. She was followed by another son 2 years after that, then twin daughters, then another son. By the time Grace was 30, they had 6 children ranging in age from infant to 6 years old, and their house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. Life wasn't always easy. There were droughts and sick cattle, harsh winters and scorching summers. There were sleepless nights with teething babies and childhood illnesses that terrified Grace until the fever broke. There were disagreements and frustrations and days when Grace wondered if she'd lost her mind to agree to this life. But there was also joy. So much joy that sometimes Grace felt like her heart couldn't possibly contain it all. There was the satisfaction of watching their ranch prosper, their herd growing year by year. There was the pride of watching their children grow, each one developing their own personality and interests. There was the deepening love between her and Garrett, the way they'd learned to work together as a true team, each one supporting the other through whatever challenges arose. And there were the quiet moments Grace treasured most. Summer evenings on the porch after the children were in bed, sitting with Garrett and watching the sun set over their land. Sunday dinners with Garrett's family, the house full of laughter and the chatter of grandchildren. Letters from Grace's father and brothers in New Mexico, keeping her connected to the place she'd come from even as she built her life in this new place. Years passed, and the children grew. Tom became a fine horseman like his father, taking over more and more of the ranch work as he got older. Margaret Rose showed an early talent for healing, often accompanying Garrett Kane when she went to help deliver babies or tend to sick neighbors. The other children each found their own paths, their own interests and talents. Grace and Garrett's love only deepened with time. They knew each other so well now, could communicate with just a glance across a crowded room. They'd weathered storms together, both literal and figurative, and come through stronger for it. On their 10th anniversary, Garrett surprised Grace with a trip back to Santa Rosa, just the two of them, leaving the children with his parents. It was strange being back in the town where it had all started. Santa Rosa had grown some, but it was still essentially the same place. They visited Grace's father, who was graying now but still running his ranch. They stopped by the church where they'd married, and Grace laid flowers on her mother's grave. But the most important visit was to the Santa Rosa Inn, where they found Rosa Hernandez running her own restaurant now, just as she dreamed. Miguel was 15, tall and handsome and working alongside his mother. When Rosa saw Grace, she burst into tears and embraced her tightly. "You came back," Rosa said. "After all these years, you came back." "I wanted to see you," Grace said, introducing Garrett properly this time, "and to thank you for the cake you made for our wedding. It was beautiful." It was nothing compared to what you did for my Miguel, Rosa insisted. Because of you standing up for him that day, he learned to stand up for himself. And that cowboy of yours, she gestured to Garrett, he taught Miguel that real men protect those who are weaker, not hurt them. Miguel is a good man because of what you both showed him. They spent the evening in Rosa's restaurant, eating delicious food and catching up on the years that had passed. It felt full circle somehow, Grace thought. The moment that had brought her and Garrett together had also changed Miguel's life and Rosa's, and rippled out in ways they'd never anticipated. On the last night of their visit, Grace and Garrett went back to the alley where they'd first met, where Grace had defended a scared little boy and Garrett had seen her bravery and kindness. They stood in that narrow space between buildings, remembering. You ever regret it? Garrett asked quietly. Leaving Santa Rosa, coming to Texas with a man you barely knew? Never, Grace said firmly, taking his hand. Not once, not for a single moment. You gave me everything I'd ever dreamed of and so much more. A real marriage, real love, a family, a purpose. How could I regret any of that? I think about it sometimes, Garrett admitted. How close we came to never meeting at all. If you'd walked down a different street that day, if I'd taken a different route, if those boys had chosen a different victim. There were so many ways our paths might never have crossed. But they did cross, Grace said, leaning into her husband's embrace. And I believe they were meant to. I believe you were always supposed to be mine and I was always supposed to be yours. We just had to find each other. I'm glad we did, Garrett murmured against her hair. I'm glad every single day. They returned to their ranch and their children, falling back into the rhythm of their life with relief and joy. The years continued to pass, marked by birthdays and holidays, and the ordinary moments that made up a life well lived. They added to their family, Grace bearing 3 more children before her body told her it was enough. 9 children in all, 9 blessings that kept them busy and happy and constantly amazed at the privilege of parenthood. As their children grew and began to leave home, building their own lives and families, Grace and Garrett found themselves settling into a new phase of their marriage. There was a bittersweet quality to watching the children leave, but also a satisfaction in knowing they'd raised them well, prepared them for the world ahead. Tom took over much of the ranch operation, allowing Garrett to slow down some as he got older. Margaret Rose married a doctor and moved to San Antonio, where she worked alongside her husband treating patients. The other children scattered to various parts of Texas and beyond, though they all came home for Christmas and other important occasions, filling the house with noise and laughter just like old times. Grace and Garrett became grandparents, then great-grandparents, their family tree growing and branching in beautiful, complicated ways. And through it all, their love remained the constant center, the foundation upon which everything else was built. On their 40th anniversary, Garrett took Grace back to that spot by the river where he'd first proposed, where she'd said yes to his offer of a life together. They were in their 60s now, their hair gray and their hands marked with age, but the connection between them was as strong as ever. 40 years, Garrett said wonderingly, holding Grace's hand as they sat on the blanket he'd spread under the same cottonwood trees. 40 years since I asked the bravest, kindest woman I'd ever met to take a chance on a cowboy with more dreams than sense. Best decision I ever made, Grace said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Would you change anything? If you could go back and do it all over again? Not a single thing, Garrett said firmly. Every joy and every sorrow, every triumph and every struggle, it all led us here. To this moment, this life, this love, I wouldn't change any of it. Neither would I, Grace agreed. Though I might have packed lighter for that first trip to Texas. Do you remember how much stuff I thought I needed? Garrett laughed, the sound warm and familiar. I remember thinking we'd never fit it all on that wagon. But I would have found a way, Grace. I would have built a second wagon if necessary, because there was no way I was leaving Santa Rosa without you. They sat in companionable silence, watching the river flow past, listening to the birds sing in the trees. So much had changed since that day 40 years ago when Garrett had offered his heart and Grace had accepted. But the essential truth of who they were to each other had never wavered. "I love you," Grace said softly, "just as much now as I did that first week. More, maybe, because now I know exactly what we built together, what we created from that one moment of connection." "I love you too," Garrett replied, pulling her closer. "And I'll love you until my last breath and beyond. You're my heart, Grace. You always have been." As the sun set over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Grace and Garrett sat together in perfect contentment. They'd built a good life, a meaningful life, full of love and laughter and legacy. And it had all started with a single moment of bravery and kindness, when a woman had defended a child and a cowboy had recognized her worth. Their story had a proper ending, though of course life continued on. They grew older still, their children caring for them as they'd once cared for their children. They celebrated 50 years of marriage, then 55, surrounded by the vast family they'd created. When Garrett finally passed away at 78, peacefully in his sleep with Grace holding his hand, she mourned him deeply. But she also celebrated the life they'd lived together, the love they'd shared, the family they'd raised. He'd kept every promise he'd made to her that day in Santa Rosa, and she'd done the same for him. Grace lived another 5 years after Garrett's death, spending her final years surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them products of the love story that had started in an alley in Santa Rosa, New Mexico territory, on a hot July day in 1883. When Grace joined Garrett at last, she was buried beside him on a hill overlooking their ranch, under a tombstone that read simply, "Grace Kane, beloved wife and mother, brave and kind." And the family that gathered to lay her to rest knew that those words captured the essence of a woman who'd had the courage to take a chance on love, and who'd spent her whole life proving that courage rewarded. The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story. But they all knew where it had started, with a cowboy and a woman and a moment of connection that had changed everything. And on quiet evenings, when the family gathered on that wide porch Garrett had built so many years ago, someone would inevitably tell the story again. The story of how their great-grandparents had met, how Grace had defended a child and Garrett had recognized her bravery and kindness, how they'd fallen in love in just a few short days and built a life that lasted a lifetime. It was a good story, a true story, and it reminded each generation that love, real love, was worth taking risks for. That sometimes the best things in life came from moments of courage and kindness, from being brave enough to stand up for what was right and open enough to recognize it when you saw it in someone else. And so the legacy continued, built on the foundation of a love story that had started in the Wild West and lasted forever, proving that the bravest thing anyone could do was open their heart and take a chance on love.